When we went to our first trip in June, we went to Berlin, Brussels, and Paris within the project, the Europe-Ukraine desk. I paid attention to the fact that our colleague journalists from Germany and France, they ask us questions about our everyday life. And this is something that, if to be honest, I never thought before. I never thought that, first of all, it may be interesting for somebody. And secondly, I simply didn't have time and energy to analyze what changed in my life as well. So after such questions, I decided that maybe there is a sense in telling a little bit of stories of how we live.
Welcome to Covering Ukraine podcast. My name is Olena Removska. I am your host and project manager of the Europe-Ukraine desk, which showcases this podcast. In this episode, we will learn more about the work of journalists in a Ukrainian public broadcasting company. Joining us are two fellows from our program, Olena Removska and Serhii Stukanov. First, a little background. This episode marks the second in a series of 4, where our Ukrainian fellows embarked on a journey to European newsrooms and exchanged their insights and experiences about coverage of Ukraine. Our editorial coordinator, Serhii, captured this discussion during their visit to Madrid.
I will invite you to present yourself first, and then we can go on.
Hello, my name is Olena Removska. I'm a journalist and a presenter at Ukraine's Public Broadcasting Company. My main focus now is interviews. So I'm preparing interviews for our digital platforms mainly. They are sometimes being broadcast on TV as well. I also is interested in how foreign media cover the war in Ukraine. And after our first trip in June, I decided to launch my English-speaking podcast, and it is called Behind Two Walls.
My name is Serhii Stukanov. I'm a presenter of the same public broadcaster, but I work on the radio department. So I'm a radio presenter, and also I am a deputy editor-in-chief of Department of Thematical Programs on the first channel of Ukrainian Radio. Since the full-scale invasion, we are working within the national marathon, and we cover all the topics linked to the war. And previously in my life, I used to be a writing journalist, so I also have experience in writing.
Okay, thank you. First question is a big question, and feel free to add to the answer of the other. Could you describe me how media and public media is structured in Ukraine, for someone who's never heard about it?
I will start with telling general story of Ukraine's public broadcaster, because it was a big dream of Ukrainian journalists after Ukraine regained its independence in 1991. So there were discussions about that we need the Ukrainian BBC. And these discussions were around the topic how it must be created. Should it be a media created from scratch? But of course it is very expensive, and Ukraine faces some economic problems. The second option was to think about reforming the existing system of the state media, because the state media is something that Soviet Union had, and this is something very common for all post-Soviet republics. If you take a look at them, you will definitely find this system of former state media. Somewhere they are still state, and some also decided to transform them into the public media. But public broadcaster became possible in Ukraine after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, because the new parliament adopted a special law, and that was the period when the reform started. And it is still ongoing, but it is also an operating media already. So it is a big company, and it was created on the basis of the former state TV and radio channels, as well as regional branches of former state media. Of course, it demanded a lot of work, and this work is still ongoing. I think the main mission was to change the minds of people who worked for state media and started working for public broadcaster, because some of them really needed to understand that they need to do good journalism now, not be like a service for the state.
Serhii, do you have something to add to what Olena just said?
Maybe I have a few words to add. And actually, when Revolution of Dignity started, at that time it was called Euromaidan. Actually, a group of journalists, they established so-called громадське телебачення, громадське television, and also громадське radio. And it was like not very big radio station. It was financed from different grants, including Great Britain, Poland, and other countries. And this radio station, Громадське Radio, is still exists and also does a great work on developing the civil society in Ukraine. But as Olena said, a few years ago, our state broadcaster was reformed to public broadcaster, national public broadcaster, and in 2018 I joined that team. I also agree with Olena that national public broadcaster, it means Ukrainian radio as a part of it, does a very great job in the sphere of Ukrainian journalism. We feel no press, we feel no influence of authorities for the last years, including the period of war. So any censorship in Ukraine doesn't exist.
You talk both about state media and public media. Maybe we can spend just some time explaining the difference, because you've seen the difference. You are in medias that are being reformed. Could you maybe explain the difference between this?
This is a very long story to explain the possible models of the public media being financed. But if to speak very general, when we say state media, we mean that there are like a very direct and specific point in the state budget directly to some state media. So it earns money like any ministry in the country, for example. And I think that there is a specific procedure of appointing the heads of the state media on the level of like cabinet of ministers or something like this. I, to be honest, don't remember this precisely. But when we speak about the financial system for public media in Ukraine, it is different. And I think the difference is not even in the system of financing, but in the system of the governing of such a difficult organism as a public broadcaster. So when the state media decided to be transformed, the main challenge was how to form the structure of the management and the supervisory board in the way that it will be independent. And it really means that there are some discussions, and it's quite difficult to imagine that the political influence will be possible on this process of appointing new head. As for now, Ukraine's public broadcaster, it is being financed via state budget. And this form is different from what BBC has in United Kingdom, because in the United Kingdom, it is something like a special tax for households. In Ukraine, as far as I understand, state and all this community which was working on creating public media, they just understood that additional tax for Ukrainian people will probably something very difficult. So in the law, they just pointed out the percent of the GDP, if I'm not mistaken, or something like this. So like the public broadcaster must receive a specific amount of money every year. And there is also, of course, very strict and tough control to how this money are being spent.
Thank you. I have another question that is a question you've been asked a lot in the newsroom we've been visiting. I wanted to know how Russia's full-scale invasion that was launched in February 2022 had an impact on your job and on your work. But maybe you want to add something about the year 2014, who maybe already had an impact, journalism and media in Ukraine.
Maybe I will start in this topic. I think that Russian full-scale invasion, of course, had a great impact on our job, because before the full-scale invasion, every presenter had their own program. Me, for instance, I had a Sunday political show one time per week, and we discussed different topics linked to the internal policy in Ukraine. But after a Russian full-scale invasion, Ukrainian radio became a part of a national marathon. I think I should tell a little bit about that process because our foreigner listeners couldn't imagine what is that. So when the war started, the big war started in 24 February of 2022, 6 biggest TV channels united into one so-called national marathon. There were as commercial TV channels. Among them, we called it like oligarch channels, and also a public broadcaster joined to this group of channels, and they shift by shift led some content in order to provide one voice during the war, according to martial law, and in order to somehow control the informational situation in the first weeks and months after Russian invasion. So Ukrainian radio became a part of this process. It means that some part of our broadcasting were just retranslating of TV channel content, and other part we produced our content. So we, with my colleagues, had 6 hours or 12 hours shifts, and we worked in this framework in order to provide our listeners with useful and important information, like information about air alerts, about some evacuational trains from the occupied territories or territories near the front line, near the borderline, and other stuff. And actually, it was not very easy because 12-hour night shift in these first weeks of war were quite nervous and full of anxiety. Actually, because Kyiv was, there was a threat of surrounding the Kyiv. A group of our journalists, we went to evacuate it or relocate it to western part of Ukraine, and during almost 3 months we broadcasted from there. Every night were air alerts, so we worked not from the regular studio but from shelters. And actually, these 3 months were maybe the most important to our listeners, because Russians tried not to destroy only military objects, not only energy infrastructure, but they also tried to destroy capacity of broadcasting in Ukraine. So actually, in particular, Kyiv television tower was injured in the first weeks after big war started. So in occupied territories, they jammed Ukrainian waves, and Ukrainian citizens there couldn't receive the TV signal. But we were told that some of them could listen to Ukrainian radio, even in occupied Mariupol. We received such messages that they couldn't know what happens in Ukraine, because Russians told them that Ukraine armed forces doesn't resist anymore. Kyiv is occupied, Kharkiv, Odessa are occupied, and so on. So Russians were trying to disinformate citizens, but some of them received information from Ukrainian radio. And then we came back to Kyiv, and we are working in a framework of National Marathon. But I have to say that since this September 2023, we started new season, and now we improved the part of our own producing programs. Now we are broadcasting the TV content maybe 20% of our broadcasting time. other broadcasting time with our own programs, because we feel that the content of national TV marathon is not always as useful as it was in the first weeks after invasion.
Thank you. Olena, do you have anything to add?
If to speak about the full-scale invasion, I think that the main difference is that now all the journalists in Ukraine are under threat. It's just because of the scale of the war. So like earlier, you were under threat only when you went to the eastern part of Ukraine or if you went to the occupied Crimea, because some of my colleagues, they had a chance to work in the occupied Crimea for for a few years. Most of them now have a ban to come into Crimea. Well, now it's impossible because of the military actions as well. And now there is this threat, despite of the fact in which Ukrainian city you are. So even if you are in Lviv, there is no guarantee that there won't be any missile attack by Russia. So I think this is like the main change. Of course, I had a change in the type of work that I do because before the full-scale invasion, I had my TV show on the first channel of the public radio. But the full-scale invasion and the martial law changed everything. So when I got back to my TV work in May 2022, when my colleagues came back from Lviv, I was offered to do some interviews with decision makers for the marathon. And now, after the year and a half of the full-scale invasion, I have my own project, and it's now for digital platforms, not for TV.
And this is something you talk about in your podcast. So Behind Two Walls, that's
Yes.
the name. Can you tell us a little bit about why this podcast and what it took about?
When we went to our first trip in June, we went to Berlin, Brussels, and Paris within the project, the Europe-Ukraine desk. I paid attention to the fact that our colleague journalists from Germany and France, they ask us questions about our everyday life. And this is something that, if to be honest, I never thought before. Like, I never thought that, first of all, it may be interesting for somebody. And secondly, I simply didn't have time and energy to analyze what changed in my life as well. So after such questions, I decided that maybe there is a sense in telling a little bit of stories of how we live. So this podcast, it's a mix of some personal feelings, emotions, and realities, as well as some professional changes. But when I choose the topic, when you download the podcast, you need to choose the topic, what do you consider your podcast is mostly about. So I choose the topic, personal journal, because it's mainly like my personal observations about how my life and work changed and is being changed during the full-scale war.
Now, going back to the more general topic of this episode, public media. You visited many public medias in these countries. Did you see any difference or any link between your practice and theirs?
It depends on the country. Western, like public medias in Western Europe, of course, they seem to have a much longer tradition and much better support. I mean, just some very simple conditions, basically the repairment, the equipment. And if you have a look on some countries which were related to Soviet Union somehow, like Bulgaria, so yeah, you see pretty much in common with, for example, their national radio and our public radio. So like the realities they face and work. But anyway, yeah, it is interesting and it is important to see the experience of public medias around the European Union, that somewhere they are facing challenges as well. And even the membership in EU and NATO may not be the guarantee that the state will not try to press journalists somehow. But anyway, yeah, we feel related to our colleagues from public media more than to colleagues from some private or commercial medias.
Maybe I want to add just a few words that in some Western countries, for instance, like France or Germany, they have their traditions of consuming of information, and like radio is quite popular, for instance, in those countries. So they have a very big audience and reach of audience. In Ukraine, for example, at least maybe last 30 years after we gained independence, radio was not very popular. So we somehow have to compete with commercial broadcasters, big commercial TV channels, or big musician radio stations. So it's like a little bit another situation, but that our situation is not as in Western countries.
As you say, you have traveled a lot in all Europe with this project. So Germany, France, Brussels, so Belgium, but the European institutions mostly. This was in June. Now in September, we're right now in Madrid. It's the end of another big trip that started in Budapest, that led us to Rome, and then Sofia in Bulgaria, and now Madrid in Spain. And it's almost over. It's our last day, actually. I wanted to know if you have learned something over this trip. Have you learned something? Have you discovered something? And also, have you been surprised by the way journalists in the EU see you, look at you, and the kind of questions they ask?
So first of all, these 6 countries had their similarities as well as some differences. And I want to think that maybe the second trip was even more interesting for me. And I'll try to explain why. Because actually, France and Germany, 2 countries which we visited in June, they are more or less known in Ukraine, and because of their importance in adopting some solutions in European Union as well as NATO, they are covered a lot in Ukraine. I mean, we speak about them daily in our work, maybe. So they were like more familiar for us as a journalists and as for observers. So maybe we had some knowledge about them. As for such countries as Bulgaria or Hungary or maybe Italy and Spain, in Ukraine, to be honest, we talk about them not as frequent as about France and Germany. And usually they are an object of our programs linked to some events in these countries, like elections and other stuff. So personally, I was really curious about these countries and about the media landscape there. Of course, maybe somehow we have a black and white picture regarding to Hungary, for instance, because we know this country mainly by statements of authorities like Orban or Szijjártó, and they made a lot of strange statements about peace on some different conditions which are not acceptable for Ukraine. That is why we look at, for example, this country is this black and white optic. But after visiting and after communication with journalists, we learned that the situation is not as bad, because there are a lot of journalists who understands the situation and are trying to inform their audience about that. From the other side, it was quite interesting for us to learn that the current media landscape and current media situation in Hungary are very similar to ours in the times of Yanukovych, President Yanukovych, before the Revolution of Dignity, when authorities also tried to control the media. And most of them were under this control and were pro-government and state-controlled. So Hungary is quite similar to this situation, and those independent media who are mainly financed from the foreign funds, they are trying to somehow survive in this landscape. Bulgaria was also a big surprise for me, a big discovery for me, because I never been to this country before, and I knew not much about this country. So it was also interesting to learn how some historical ties with Russia impact on current media situation, and actually we maybe discovered that this historical ties with Russia and sympathy to Russia doesn't mean that Bulgarians are against Ukraine. So in their minds, it not the contradiction to have sympathy to Russia and at the same time to feel sorrow and to help Ukraine. So very interesting. There are a lot of differences between situations in media in these countries, and maybe if to describe them all, it will take us hours, actually.
I will not be so precise, but I just want to tell a small story, a personal story. At the beginning of the full-scale invasion, in March, I stayed in Kyiv, and I didn't work as a presenter of the first channel of Ukrainian Public broadcaster. So what I was doing, I was going live for different foreign channels, as well as providing some comments about the life in Kyiv during the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And I also monitored how foreign media covered the war in Ukraine, because I was, I would say, maybe even shocked with the amount of information that appeared in foreign media, like all the starting pages of all the leading medias were about Ukraine. So I started monitoring this, and at some stage I decided that it's probably interesting for other people as well to understand how the world is speaking about the war in Ukraine. So I decided to launch my Telegram channel, and it is about how foreign media cover the war in Ukraine, what is being written there, and are there any controversial topics. So of course, when I saw an opportunity to go to some countries and to talk to my colleague journalists, in particular with the media outlets that were in my list of those newspapers and websites I monitor during the day, I mean the program, the Europe-Ukraine Desk, I decided that it's a good chance for me to understand where they see that there are gaps in their understanding of Ukraine, where we as Ukrainian journalists can help, and maybe to add something to my understanding of what they are dealing with in this topic. So I would say that both of these trips, it's like journeys to understand how foreign journalists work with the topic of Russian-Ukrainian war. And I would say that it was very useful for me, first of all, to make my own picture of the world bigger, because, of course, we are very much involved and concentrated on the Russian-Ukrainian war, and sometimes we do not pay attention to some global context. And when you go to specific countries and your colleague journalists, they start telling you why they report about this or that and how it is related to to some events in their countries. So it's like a puzzle in your head. And also, I think that it's just very useful for foreign journalists as well to talk to Ukrainian journalists, because sometimes you see that they have some very simple but obvious questions, like, is it bad for you as a journalist that you are personally involved in this war? Or can you be unbiased if you are inside Ukraine? And these are topics that I think that it's useful for the journalists, for foreign journalists to talk about with Ukrainians. Of course, it is challenging, it is difficult, but maybe this is a chance for them to imagine themselves in this unfortunate situation. None of us would ever wish anybody this experience, but it may be just useful to look at your profession and what you do from kind of a different angle and understand what are the challenges for Ukrainian journalists as well.
Good. Thank you. We break bubbles. We break mediatic bubbles. That's something about today. Everyone is in a bubble, and organizing meetings, we break them. Thanks a lot. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Covering Ukraine, recorded by our editorial coordinator Sara Lulepers with Olena Removska and Serhii Stukanov. My name is Antonina Rybka. I am project manager of the Europe-Ukraine Desk. Luba Hook edited, sound designed and mixed this episode. The views expressed by this episode guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the media they work for, nor n-ost, nor the European Commission, who funded this project. The podcast covering Ukraine was created as part of the Europe-Ukraine Desk, a program that aims at building bridges between journalists from the EU and Ukrainian journalists. You can get in touch with us at eud@n-ost.org. It is in the description of this episode. Also in the description there is the link to Olena Removska's podcast Behind the Walls, mentioned in this episode. Maybe consider telling a friend about this show if you like it. We will come back soon. Until then, take care.